The Steam House by Jules Verne. Translated by Agnes D. Kingston. Book 2, Chapter 4. A Queen of the Terai. This remark of the zoologist ended our visit to the kraal, as it was time to return to Steam House. I must say that Captain Hood and Matthias Van Guit did not part the best friends in the world. One wished to destroy the wild beasts of the Terai, the other wished to catch them, yet there were plenty to satisfy both. It was, however, agreed that intercourse between the kraal and the sanitarium should be frequent. Each was to give information to the other. Van Guit's shikaris, who were well acquainted with this sort of expedition and knew every turn of the forest, were to render a service to Captain Hood by showing him the tracks of animals. The zoologist most obligingly placed all his men, and especially Kalagani, at his disposal. This native, although but recently engaged at the kraal, showed himself very intelligent and completely to be depended on. In return, Captain Hood promised, as far as lay in his power, to aid in the capture of the animals which were yet wanting to complete the stock of Matthias Van Guit. Before leaving the kraal, Sir Edward Munro, who probably did not purpose making many visits there, again thanked Kalagani, whose intervention had saved him. He told him that he should always be welcome at Steam House. The native saluted coldly. Although he must have felt some sentiment of satisfaction at hearing the man whose life he had preserved speak thus, he allowed no trace of it to appear on his countenance. We returned in time for dinner. As may be imagined, Matthias Van Guit was our chief subject of conversation. "By Jove, what an absurd fellow he is," said the captain. "What with his gestures, his fine choice of words, and his grand expressions, he is a caution. Only if he fancies that wild beasts are mere subjects for exhibition, he is greatly mistaken." On the 3 following days, the 27th, 28th, and 29th of June, rain fell with such violence that our hunters, to their great annoyance, could not dream of leaving Steam House. In such dreadful weather it would be impossible to find a track, and the carnivora, who are no fonder of water than our cats, would not willingly leave their dens. At last the weather showed signs of clearing, and Hood, Fox, Goomy, and I made preparations for descending to the kraal. During the morning some mountaineers came to pay us a visit. They had heard that a miraculous pagoda had been transported to the Himalayas, and a lively feeling of curiosity had in consequence brought them to Steam House. They were fine types of the Tibetan frontier race, full of warlike virtues, of tried loyalty, practicing liberal hospitality, and far superior, both morally and physically, to the natives of the plains. The supposed pagoda astonished them, but Behemoth so impressed them as to draw from them marks of adoration. He was now at rest. What would not these good people have felt if they had seen him vomiting forth flame and smoke and ascending with a steady step the rough slopes of their mountains? Colonel Munro gave a kind reception to these men, who usually frequented the territories of Nepal on the Indo-Chinese boundary. The conversation turned for a time on that part of the frontier where Nana Sahib had taken refuge after the defeat of the sepoys. These hillmen knew scarcely so much as we did ourselves on this matter. The rumors of the nabob's death had reached them, and they cast no doubt upon it. As to those of his companions who had survived, perhaps they had sought a more secure refuge in the depths of Tibet, but to find them in that country would have been difficult. Indeed, if Colonel Munro, in coming to the north of the peninsula, had had any idea of throwing light on Nana Sahib's history, this reply should have satisfied him. In listening to our visitors, he remained thoughtful, and took no more part in the conversation. Captain Hood put some questions to them but on quite another point. He learnt that wild beasts, more particularly tigers, had made frightful ravages in the lower zone of the Himalayas. Farms, and even whole villages, had been deserted by their inhabitants. Many flocks of goats and sheep had been already destroyed, besides numerous victims among the natives. Notwithstanding the considerable sum offered by the government, 300 rupees for every tiger's head, the number of these creatures did not appear to diminish, and people were asking themselves whether they would not soon be obliged to leave the country to them entirely. The hillman also added this information, that the tigers did not confine themselves entirely to the terai. Whenever the plain offered them tall grass, jungle, and trees among which they could crouch, there they might be met with in great numbers. "The evil beasts," was their expression. These honest people had very good cause not to profess the same opinions on the subject of tigers as the zoologist Matthias Van Guit and our friend Captain Hood. The mountaineers retired, enchanted with the reception they had met with, and promising to repeat their visit to Steam House. After their departure, our preparations were completed, and Captain Hood, our 2 companions, and I, all well armed, ready for any encounter, descended to the terai. On arriving at the clearing, in which was the trap from which we had so fortunately extracted Matthias Van Guit, that gentleman presented himself before our eyes, not without some ceremony. 5 or 6 of his people, Kalagani among the number, were occupied in getting a tiger, which had been caught during the night, from the snare into a travelling cage. It was a magnificent animal indeed, and, as a matter of course, caused Captain Hood to feel corresponding envy. "One less in the terai," he murmured, between 2 sighs, which found their echo in Fox's manly breast. "One more in the menagerie," replied the zoologist. "Still 2 tigers, a lion, and 2 leopards, and I shall be in a position to honor my engagements before the end of the season. Will you come with me to the kraal, gentlemen?" "Thank you," said Captain Hood. "Today, however, we are out on our own account." "Kalagani is at your disposal, Captain Hood," replied the purveyor. "He is well acquainted with the forest, and may be useful to you." "We will gladly take him as a guide." "Farewell, gentlemen," said Van Guit. "I wish you good sport, but promise me not to massacre them all." "We will leave you a few," returned Hood. And Matthias Van Guit, saluting us with a superb bow, following his cage, and soon disappeared among the trees. "Forward," said Hood. "Forward, my men. Hurrah for my 42nd." "And my 38th," responded Fox. "And my 1st," I added. But the quiet way in which I uttered the words made the captain laugh. Evidently I did not feel the sacred fire. Hood turned to Kalagani. "So you know the forest well?" he asked. "I have been over it 20 times, day and night, in every direction," replied the man. "Have you heard that a particular tiger has been lately noticed near the kraal?" "Yes, but this tiger is a tigress. She has been seen 2 miles from here, in the upper part of the forest, and they have been trying to get hold of her for several days. Should you like—" "That's just what we want," answered Captain Hood, without giving the native time to finish his sentence. To follow Kalagani was the best thing we could do, so we did it. Wild beasts were apparently very plentiful in the terai, but here, as everywhere else, each required 2 bullocks a week for their own particular consumption. Just calculate what the cost of such a keep would be to the entire peninsula. It must not be imagined that the numerous tigers visit inhabited country unless impelled by necessity. Till urged by hunger, they remained hidden in their lairs, and it would be a mistake to imagine that they were met with at every step. Very many travelers have journeyed through these forests without ever catching a glimpse of one. When a hunt is organized, the first thing to be done is to reconnoiter the places most frequented by the animal, and especially to find out the stream or spring to which he comes to slake his thirst. Sometimes this is not sufficient, and he has to be attracted to the spot. This is done easily enough by putting a quarter of a beef tied to a stake in some place surrounded by trees and rocks to shelter the hunters. This, at least, is the way they proceed in the forest. In the plains it is another thing, and there the elephant becomes the most useful auxiliary to man in his dangerous sport. These animals have, however, to be trained to the work, though even then they are sometimes seized with a panic which renders the position of the men perched on their backs dangerous in the extreme. It must also be said that sometimes the tiger does not hesitate to spring on the elephant. The struggle between the man and beast then takes place on the very back of the gigantic steed, and it is rarely indeed that it does not end in a favor of the tiger. In this way the grand hunts of the Rajahs and great sportsmen of India are conducted, but it was by no means Captain Hood's manner of proceeding. He was going to search for tigers on foot, and it was on foot that he was accustomed to fight them. In the meantime we were following Kalagani, who was walking on at a round pace. Reserved as all Hindus are, he spoke little and contented himself with replying briefly to the questions which we put to him. After walking for an hour, we halted by a rapid stream, and on its banks were the still fresh tracks of animals. In a little glade was a stake, to which was fastened a quarter of beef. The bait had not been entirely untouched. It had been recently gnawed by the teeth of jackals, those thieves of the Indian fauna, always in quest of prey, but this was not intended for them. A dozen or so of these creatures fled at our approach and left the place clear. "Captain," said Kalagani, "we must wait for the tigress here. You see that it is a good place for an ambush." It was indeed easy to post ourselves in trees or behind rocks, so as to have a crossfire over the post in the center of the glade. This was immediately done. Gumi and I took our places in the same tree. Hood and Fox perched themselves in two magnificent oaks opposite each other. Kalagani hid behind a high rock, which he could climb if the danger became imminent. The animal would be thus enclosed in a circle, from which it could not escape. All the chances were against it, although we were as yet reckoning on the unforeseen. We had now to wait. We could still hear the hoarse bark of the dispersed jackals in the neighboring thickets, but they did not dare to return. Nearly an hour had thus passed when the yelps suddenly ceased. Almost immediately 2 or 3 jackals bounded out of the wood, and, darting across the glade, disappeared in the thicker part of the forest. A sign from Kalagani, who was ready to climb his rock, told us to be on our guard. We guessed that the precipitant flight of the jackals must have been caused by the approach of some savage animal. The tigress, no doubt, so that we were ready to see her at any moment appear on one side or other of the glade. Our guns were all ready. Captain Hood and his man held their weapons pointed at the place from which the jackals had issued. Very soon I saw a slight agitation among the upper branches of the thicket. The snapping of dry wood was also heard. Some animal was approaching, but slowly and warily. Though evidently seeing nothing of the hunters in wait among the branches, its instinct warned it that the place was not quite safe. Certainly, unless urged by hunger and attracted by the smell of the beef, it would not have ventured further. At last we could see it through the branches, where it stopped, probably mistrustful. It was a huge tigress, powerful and active. She began to advance, crouching, and with an undulatory movement. With one consent, We allowed her to approach the post. She smelt the ground. She drew herself up and arched her back like a gigantic cat, preparing to spring. Suddenly 2 sharp reports rang out. 42! cried Captain Hood. 38! shouted Fox. The captain and his man had fired at the same moment, and with such true aim that the animal, shot through the heart, fell dead on the ground. Kalagani ran up. We all quickly descended from our various trees. The tigress did not stir. But to whom belonged the honor of having killed her? To the captain or to Fox? This was an important question, as may be imagined. The beast was examined. 2 balls were found in the heart. "Come," said Hood, not without a slight touch of regret in his voice. "We've got half a tiger apiece." "So we have, Captain, half a tiger apiece," answered Fox in the same tone. And I verily believe neither of the 2 would, on any account, have given up the share he reckoned to his own account. Such was this wonderful shot, of which the clearest result was that the animal had fallen without a struggle, and consequently without danger to the assailants, a very rare occurrence. Fox and Gumi remained on the field of battle in order to despoil the animal of her magnificent skin, whilst Captain Hood and I returned to Steam House. It is not my intention to note every incident of our expeditions into the Terai forest, but only those which present some particular characteristic. I shall content myself with saying that, so far, Captain Hood and Fox had had no reason to complain. On the 10th of July, during a hoodie hunt, a happy chance again favored them, without their running any real danger. The hoodie, or hut, its walls pierced with loopholes, is built on the borders of a stream at which animals are accustomed to come and drink. Used to the sight of these erections, they are not alarmed, and carelessly expose themselves to be shot at. But to be safe, it is necessary to mortally wound the creature at the first, or he becomes dangerous, for the hut does not always protect the hunter from his infuriated spring. This is exactly what occurred on the occasion of which I am about to speak. Matthias van Guit accompanied us. Perhaps he hoped that some tiger, slightly wounded, might fall to his share, to take home to his kraal and be cured. This time our sportsmen had 3 tigers to deal with, but the first discharge was not sufficient to prevent them from springing onto the walls of the hoodie. The 2 first, to the zoologist's great disgust, were killed by a second ball, but the 3rd leapt right in, his shoulder covered with blood, but not mortally wounded. "We must have that fellow," cried Van Guit, who risked not a little in speaking thus. "We must take him alive." Scarcely had he uttered the words, when, with a bound, the animal was upon him. He was overthrown in an instant, and it would have been all up with our friend had not Captain Hood sent a ball through the tiger's head, and thus saved the Dutchman, who sprang up, exclaiming, "Well, Captain, you might just as well have waited." "Waited? What for?" answered Captain Hood. "Until that brute had torn you to bits with his claws? A wound with a claw needn't be mortal." "All right," returned Captain Hood quietly. "Another time I will wait." This tiger, however, instead of figuring in a menagerie, was fated only to be used as a hearth-rug. But it brought up the list to 42 for the captain and 38 for his man, without counting the half-tigress. It must not be imagined that these grand hunts made us neglect smaller ones. Monsieur Parizard could not allow that. Antelopes, chamois, great bustards, of which there were numbers around Steam House, partridges and hares supplied our table with a great variety of game. When we went into the Terai, it was very rarely that Banks accompanied us. Although these expeditions began to interest me, he did not seem to care for them. The upper zones of the Himalayas evidently offered him greater attractions, and he took pleasure in these excursions, especially when Colonel Munro consented to join him. But it was only once or twice that the engineer could persuade his friend to do so. We observed that since our installation in the sanitarium, Sir Edward Munro had again become anxious. He spoke less, he kept aloof from us, but held long conferences with Sergeant McNeill. Were these two men meditating some new project which they wished to keep concealed even from Banks? On the 13th of July, Matthias Van Gweet came to pay us a visit. Less favoured than the captain, he had not added a single fresh tenant to his menagerie. Neither tigers, lions, nor leopards seemed disposed to be caught. The idea of going to exhibit themselves in the countries of the West apparently did not allure them. Consequently, the zoologist was in a very bad humour, and did not seek to hide it. Kalagani and two shikaris accompanied him on this visit. The situation of our house pleased him much. Colonel Munro begged him to remain and dine. He consented with pleasure to honour our table. Whilst waiting for dinner, Van Gweet wished to go over Steam House, the comfort of which was a contrast to the modest arrangements of the kraal. Our dwellings drew forth many compliments from him, but I must confess that Behemoth did not excite his admiration in the least. A naturalist such as he was could not but be indifferent to this masterpiece of mechanics. Remarkable as it was, how could he admire a mere imitation, a mechanical creation? "Do not think badly of our elephant, Mr. Van Gweet," said Banks. "He is a powerful animal, who would make nothing of drawing all your menagerie cages and our cars as well." "I have my buffaloes," answered the naturalist, "and I prefer their slow and steady pace." "Behemoth fears neither the claws nor teeth of tigers," cried Hood. "No doubt, gentlemen," replied Matthias Van Gweet, "but why should wild beasts attack him? They would not care for iron flesh." Though the zoologist did not conceal his indifference to our elephant, his men and Kalagani in particular were never tired of staring at it. Mingled with their admiration for the gigantic animal, there was evidently some superstitious respect. Kalagani appeared very much surprised when the engineer repeated that our iron elephant was more powerful than all the teams at the kraal put together. This was an opportunity for Captain Hood to describe, not without pride, our adventure with the 3 proboscidate animals belonging to Prince Goro Singh. A slight incredulous smile curled the lip of the naturalist, but he said nothing. Dinner passed off excellently well. Van Gweet did great justice to it. The larder had been well supplied with the product of our last excursions, and Monsieur certainly surpassed himself. The cellar of Steam House was well stocked with various liquors, which our guest had much appreciated, especially some French wines, after imbibing which his matchless tongue wagged faster than ever. So well did he relish them, that when we rose from table, to judge by his uncertain mode of progression, it was evident that if the wine had gone to his head, it had also gone down into his legs. Evening came on, and at last we separated, the best friends in the world, Matthias Van Gweet, with the aid of his attendants, reaching his kraal in safety. On the 16th of July, something occurred which made a regular quarrel between the zoologist and the captain. Hood shot a tiger just as it was about to enter one of the traps, and though this made his 43rd, it was not the 8th which the purveyor wished for. However, after a lively interchange of epithets, harmony was once more restored, thanks to Colonel Munro's intervention, and Captain Hood promised to respect any animal who had intentions of being caught in Van Gweet's traps. For the ensuing days the weather was detestable. We were obliged to stay indoors, nolens volens. We were anxious that the rainy season should come to an end, and that could not now be long, for it had already lasted for more than 3 months. If the program of our journey was carried out as Banks had arranged, we had only 6 weeks to pass in our sanitarium. On the 23rd of July, some hillmen came to pay a second visit to Colonel Munro. Their village, called Suwari, lay but 5 miles from our encampment on the upper limit of the Terai. One of them told us that for several weeks past a tigress had been making frightful ravages on this part of the territory. The flocks were being carried off, and they even talked of abandoning Suwari as uninhabitable. There was no safety in it, either for man or beast. Snares and traps had been tried without any success on the ravenous beast, which already was spoken of as one of the most formidable ever known among even the oldest mountaineers. It may be guessed that the story excited Captain Hood at once. He immediately offered to accompany the men back to their village, ready to put his hunting experience and his accurate aim at the service of these honest people, who, I imagine, counted not a little on such an offer. "Shall you come, Mauclair?" asked the captain in the tone of a man who did not wish to influence a determination. "Certainly," I replied. "I should not like to miss such an interesting expedition." "I will join you this time," said the engineer. "That's capital, Banks." "Yes, Hood, I have a great wish to see you at work." "Am I not to go, Captain?" asked Fox. "Ah, you rascal," laughed his master. "You won't be sorry for an opportunity to make up your half-tigress. Yes, Fox, yes, you shall go." As we should probably be absent from Steamhouse for 3 or 4 days, Bank asked the colonel whether he would not like to go with us to the village of Suwari. Sir Edward thanked him, but said he proposed to profit by our absence to visit the middle zone of the Himalayas above the belt of the forest, with Gumi and Sergeant McNeill. Banks did not urge the matter. It was decided that we should set out directly for the kraal, in order to borrow from Matthias Van Guit a few of his shikaris, who might be useful to us. About midday we arrived there, and acquainted the naturalist with our intentions. He could not conceal his secret satisfaction in hearing of the exploits of this tigress. "Well calculated," said he, "to heighten the reputation of these felidae of the peninsula in the minds of connoisseurs." He then placed at our disposal 3 of his men, besides Kalagani, always ready for any danger. It was settled with Captain Hood that, if by any possibility the tigress should be taken living, it was to belong to Van Guit's menagerie. What an attraction it would be to have a placard hung in front of its cage, stating in eloquent terms the great deeds of "one of the queens of the Terai, who has devoured no less than 138 persons of both sexes." Our little band left the kraal about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Before 4 o'clock, after ascending in an easterly direction, we arrived without adventure at Suwari. The panic here was at its height. That very morning a native had been surprised by the tigress near a stream and carried off into the forest. We were received most hospitably in the house of a well-to-do farmer, an Englishman. Our host had more reason than anyone else to complain of the savage beast, and would willingly pay several thousand rupees for its skin. "Several years ago, Captain Hood," he said, "a tigress obliged the inhabitants of 13 villages of the central provinces to take flight, and in consequence 150 miles were forced to lie fallow. Well, if that sort of thing takes place here, the whole province will have to be deserted." "Have you employed every possible means to get rid of this tigress?" asked Banks. "Yes, indeed, everything. Traps, pitfalls, and even baits prepared with strychnine. Nothing has succeeded." "Well, my friend," said Captain Hood, "I can't promise for certain to give satisfaction, but I assure you we will do our very best." Thereupon a bet, too, was organized for that same day. Our party and the shikaris were joined by about 20 mountaineers, who were well acquainted with the country. Although Banks was so little of a sportsman, he accompanied our expedition with the most lively interest. For 3 days we searched about all round the neighborhood, but with no result, except that a couple of tigers, which no one thought much of, fell by the captain's gun. 45 was all the remark he made. At last the tigress signalized herself by a fresh misdeed. A buffalo, belonging to our host, disappeared from its pasture, and its remains were found about a quarter of a mile from the village. The assassination, premeditated murder as a lawyer would say, had been accomplished before daybreak. The assassin could not be far off. But was the principal author of this crime indeed the tigress so long sought in vain? The natives of Suwari had no doubt of it. "I know it was my uncle. He did the mischief," said one of the villagers to us. My uncle is the natives' usual name for the tiger, they believing that the soul of each of their ancestors is lodged for eternity in the body of some member of the cat tribe. On this occasion it would certainly have been more correct to say my aunt. It was immediately decided that we should set out in quest of the animal without waiting for night, as the darkness would conceal it more effectually than ever. We knew it must be gorged, and would probably not leave its den for 2 or 3 days. We took the field. Starting from the place where the buffalo had been seized, traces of blood showed the direction the tigress had taken. These marks led us towards a thicket, which had been beaten many times already without discovering anything. It was resolved to surround this spot so as to form a circle through which the animal could not escape, at least without being seen. The villagers dispersed themselves around, so as to gradually narrow the circle. Captain Hood, Caligani, and I were on one side, Banks and Fox on the other, but in constant communication with the rest of the people. Each point of the ring was dangerous, since the tigress might try to break through anywhere. There was no doubt that the animal was in this thicket, for the traces which entered on one side did not reappear on the other. This did not prove, though, that it was its habitual retreat, for it had been searched before, but the presumptions were that it was its present refuge. It was early, only 8 o'clock. When all arrangements were made, we began to advance noiselessly, contracting the investing circle. In half an hour we were at the limit of the first trees. Nothing had occurred, nothing had announced the presence of any creature, and for my own part I began to question whether we were not wasting our time. Each could now only see the men next to him, and yet it was important that we should advance with perfect unanimity. It had been previously agreed that the man who first entered the wood should fire a shot. The signal was given by Captain Hood, who was always first in everything, and the border was crossed. I looked at my watch. It was 35 minutes past 8. In a quarter of an hour the circle had so drawn in that our elbows touched, but we still had seen nothing. Till now the silence had been unbroken, except by the snapping of dry branches under our feet. Suddenly a roar was heard. "The beast is in there!" cried Captain Hood, pointing to the mouth of a cavern in a mass of rocks and trees. He was not mistaken. If it was not the usual haunt of the tigress, it was evidently her refuge now. Hood, Banks, Fox, Caligani, and several other men approached the narrow opening to which the bloody traces led. "We shall have to go in there," said the captain. "A dangerous job," remarked Banks. "It will be a serious matter for the first who enters." "I shall go in, though," returned Hood, looking carefully to his rifle. "After me, Captain," put in Fox, who was already stooping to enter the cave. "No, no, Fox," cried Hood. "This is my affair." "Ah, Captain," said Fox in most persuasive yet reproachful accents, "I'm six behind you." Just imagine their reckoning up their tigers at such a moment. "Neither one nor the other shall enter," exclaimed Banks. "No, I can't allow it." "There is another way," interrupted Kaligani. "What is that?" "To smoke her out," replied the native. "She will be forced to appear then. It will be easier and less risky to kill her outside." "Kaligani is right," said Banks. "Come, my men, dead wood, dry grass. Stop up the opening partly, so that the wind may drive the smoke and flame inside. The beast must either be roasted or run away." "It will run away," said the native. "So much the better," remarked Captain Hood. "We shall be ready to give her a salute on her way." In a few minutes branches, grass, and dead wood, of which there was plenty lying near, were piled in a heap before the entrance to the den. Nothing had stirred inside. Nothing could be seen in the gloomy depths. Yet our ears could not have deceived us. The roar certainly came from that place. A light was set to the heap, and soon the whole was in a blaze. From this bonfire issued a thick, choking smoke, blowing right into the interior. A second roar, more furious than the first, burst forth. The creature was being driven to extremities and would make a rush. We all waited anxiously, our faces towards the rocks, and partially sheltered by the trees, so as to avoid the first infuriated spring. The captain had chosen another position, which, to suit him, must of course be the most perilous. This was a gap between the brushwood, the only one which offered a passage from the den. There Hood knelt on one knee, so as to steady his aim, his rifle at his shoulder and looking as if carved in marble. 3 minutes had passed since the fire was first lighted, when a third roar, a stifled, suffocating roar, was heard. A huge monster dashed through the fire and smoke. The tigress at last. "Fire!" shouted Banks. 10 shots rang out, though we found afterwards that not one had touched the animal. Amid volumes of smoke, a second and yet longer bound carried the animal towards the thicket. Captain Hood, who waited with the greatest coolness, fired, hitting her below the shoulder. Like a lightning flash the tigress was upon him. Over he went, and in another moment her terrible claws would have torn open his head. But Kaligani sprang forward, knife in hand. In an instant the brave fellow had seized the tigress by the throat. The animal on this sudden attack shook off the native and turned upon him. Feeling himself free, the captain leapt up, and grasping the knife which had fallen from Kaligani's hand, plunged it into the creature's very heart. The tigress rolled over. This exciting scene had taken place in less time than it takes to write it. "Bug Mariaga! Bug Mariaga!" shouted the natives, meaning, "The tigress is dead." Yes, quite dead. But what a magnificent animal! 10 feet from muzzle to tail, tall in proportion, and its enormous paws armed with long claws, which looked as if they had been sharpened up on a grindstone. Whilst we were admiring the creature, the natives, who had good reason for the grudge they bore against it, overwhelmed it with invectives. Kaligani approached Captain Hood. "I thank you, Sahib," he said. "What are you thanking me for?" cried Hood. "It's I who owe you thanks, my brave fellow. If it hadn't been for you, I should have been done for." "I should have killed without your help," replied the man coldly. "What? By Jove, did you rush forward, knife in hand, to stab the tigress just as she was going to tear my skull open?" "You killed him, though, Sahib, and that makes your 46th. "Hurrah! Hurrah!" cried the natives. "Hurrah for Captain Hood!" The captain had certainly every right to add this tigress to his list, but he gave Kalagani a grateful shake of the hand. "Come to Steam-house," said Banks to the man. "Your shoulder has been torn and is bleeding, but we will find something in our medicine chest to heal the wound." Kalagani acquiesced, and so, having taken leave of the inhabitants of Suwari, who loaded us with thanks, we all proceeded in the direction of our sanitarium. The shikaris now left us to return to the kraal. Again they went back empty-handed, and if Matthias van Gweet had counted on this queen of the Terai, he must mourn for her. Under the circumstances, it was utterly impossible to take her alive. We reached Steam-house about midday. Here unexpected news awaited us. To our extreme disappointment, Colonel Munro, Sergeant McNeil, and Gumi had gone away. A note addressed to Banks told us not to be uneasy at their absence, that Sir Edward was desirous of reconnoitering the Nepalese frontier, so as to clear up certain suspicions relating to the companions of Nana Sahib, but that he would return before the time at which we had arranged to leave the Himalayas. On hearing this note read, I fancied that an involuntary movement denoting vexation escaped Kalagani. What could have occasioned this? I was mistaken, no doubt. End of Book 2, Chapter 4.